remind me to record, that would be wonderful. You can just yell it in the middle of when I'm talking. That would be totally fine. My 2 classes towards later in the day, I ended up not recording them halfway through, and that is not good. So if somebody wants to remind me, please do so. You don't have to be polite about it. You can just yell, please record, or just record, or hey lady, get it together. That's fine too. All right. Just making a note of who is online. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Who am I not? Oh, Tamara and Acer now. Okay, cool. Very good. Zach, do you have a question, or is your hand still up from when we raised our hands? You can feel free to put it down if you want. Okay, 2 people just walked in, James and Nick. Hi, Nick. Welcome to class in person. I'm going to make a note of it. So let me see. Is anyone who is not here? So I have Kuhn is here, Carson is here, James is here, Joey is here, Viv is here, Selena, Jaren, Ian, McKenna, Teresa is here, Logan is here, Brad is here, Hillary's here, and Nick is here. Cool. Awesome. It looks like we have everybody. Okay, before we get started on this morning's class, I want to very quickly mention something that I failed to mention in class on Monday, and that is what I have online for you, which are called supplementary learning modules. So this is mentioned in the syllabus, but I just want to highlight it here. So alongside every lecture for this course, I have created what I'm calling a supplementary learning module. So you can see they're over here in this tab below the course readings and other materials. And they're all, well, here, let me put it in the mode that you will be able to see, student mode. They are all sort of listed and they give you sort of a sense of what we'll be discussing. These are optional. You do not absolutely have to do these. The point of doing these is that I know this is a weird semester, and so you might be looking for a way to reinforce the material that we are going over in class. This is a way to do that. I just want to assure everyone that there's not some mysterious test question that's only on the supplementary learning modules that I'm not going to talk about in class and that's, going to appear on the midterm exam, okay? These are, again, optional. You do not have to do them. But if you're interested in a particular topic that we discuss in class, or you're feeling like you're a little behind and you want to reinforce the material, this is a good place to go. And again, they will be posted for every lecture session, okay? Any questions on the supplementary learning modules? All right. Let's go ahead and get started with class today. So our focus today is going to be the basics of world geography. So in Monday's class, I mentioned to you all that this semester we are going to be examining the foundations and the applications of world regional geography. And we're going to do so in a kind of unique way. We're going to be doing it through the lens of migration, human migration to the United States. But we need some background. We need to understand some core concepts before we get started. And so today, I want to do that. I want to go over some of the foundations of geography. And specifically, I want us to define geography. What is world regional geography? What is this enterprise we will be engaged in this semester? What is the study of geography? I also want to identify and define some of the main concepts that are central to the study of geography. One of those that we're going to go into in a bit of depth is population growth. So why do populations grow and decline? Why are people located in particular places rather than others? And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about what makes a region a region. So you probably have some ideas in your head about what the world regions are that we're going to be studying. But how do we define a region? And why do we consider certain clusters of countries or certain clusters of states in the United States or cities or towns to be regions and not others? So that's sort of our roadmap for today. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, excellent. Moving on, what is geography? So how do we define geography? What are we going to be studying in this class? So at its core, we can define geography as the spatial study of the Earth's surface. So geographers study the Earth's physical characteristics. These are things like landforms, rivers, other bodies of water. Geographers also study a place's inhabitants and cultures. And geographers study really important phenomena like climate. So we can think of geography as a very broad discipline. There's a lot of stuff that fits within the discipline of geography. But further, we can define geography as really consisting of two main branches. So we have this big umbrella of geography. And you can imagine two little lines coming out from geography and two sort of subfields. And those two main branches are what we call physical geography and human geography. So physical geography refers to the spatial study of natural phenomena that make up the environment. So this is in a lot of ways. So if we go back to our definition of geography, the focus of physical geography is the sort of first part, the physical characteristics, as well as things like climate. The middle part of our big definition here, inhabitants and cultures, that corresponds to a second main branch of geography, what we call human geography. So human geography refers to the study of human activity in relationship to the Earth's surface. I'll tell you now, in this course, we are going to be focusing mostly on the latter. We are going to be thinking about both physical geography and human geography, but we're going to be paying special attention to human geography. Does anybody have any questions? Is everybody with me so far?
I have a question.
Yeah.
These are going to be on Blackboard.
Yes. So my slides, they're not going to be on Blackboard at the end of every class. I'm going to take all of week 1 slides and put them on Blackboard on Fridays, so after our last class of the week. So you don't have to worry about getting every single thing down. I also, so usually, sort of, I'll tip you guys off on this. Usually I don't like to put definitions on slides, but I understand we're in a bit of a strange semester, right? Where I'm wearing a mask, you might not be able to hear me great. We have folks online who hopefully can hear me okay, but you know, technical difficulties and glitches. So I'm sort of this semester erring on the side of putting more on slides. But again, these will be posted, and so you don't have to worry about getting every single word down, okay? Good question, Nick. Thank you. Okay, so we have our two branches of geography. Let's talk a little bit about sort of where geography comes from. So the term geography itself comes from two Greek terms, the term geo, which means the earth, and the term graphia, which means to write. And so that's exactly what many early geographers actually did, or they wrote about the earth. One of the sort of early geographers considered among the fathers of geography is an individual by the name of Eratosthenes, who was a Greek. And he wrote the first book on the subject in the 3rd century BCE. He wrote a 3-volume text titled Geographia. It included maps of the entire known world at that time. Of course, that was quite a small world at the time in the 3rd century BCE. He's also the first person credited with calculating the circumference of the Earth. And many early geographers focused on map making. They were what we call cartographers. They created and studied maps. And those early maps focused on places like Babylon, Polynesia, the Arabian Peninsula, and they were used for navigation, for early travels. Now, during the Middle Ages, this is sort of a brief sort of background history. You don't have to know all the details. But during the Middle Ages, the study of geography as an academic inquiry somewhat declined with the fall of the Roman Empire specifically. But following that, a Muslim geographer named Muhammad al-Idrisi created one of the most advanced maps of pre-modern times and inspired future geographers from the region. So as I mentioned earlier, geography is a big, broad topic that encompasses a lot of things. Some people who study geography, again, focusing more on human geography, they do research where they go talk to people. Some geographers don't go places or do anything. They sit behind a computer and use advanced statistical tools to calculate distances and to examine other natural phenomena. But one thing that unites the entire field of geography is what we think of as the spatial perspective. And so what's most important when we're talking about the spatial perspective is that what kinds of questions do geographers ask? They tend to first ask where questions. Where are people located? Where do people move to? Where are certain rivers and other landforms, mountain ranges, where are those located? So they start with a sort of where question, and then oftentimes we turn from a where question, where something is, to a why question. Why did African Americans concentrated mostly in the southern United States, beginning in the early 20th century, start to migrate to the Midwest and to the West and to the Northeast? So we're starting with a where, people going from one place to another, and then we're asking why. What drives those changes? So that's a sort of, in broad strokes, how geographers think about things, how geographers ask questions. Any questions up until now? Is everybody with me? Okay. how do geographers answer these where questions? There are a number of ways to answer where questions, right? And I want to talk about two of the main ways right now. So the first is what we call relative location. So a relative location thinks about a place with respect to the location of another place. So we're currently in Rausch Hall. What's the relative location of Rausch Hall? Well, Rausch Hall is next to Towers Hall. It's south of Towers Hall. That's what we think of as a relative location, right? Because I couldn't tell you where the exact location of Rausch Hall is, except for in relation to this other place, Towers Hall, or some other location on campus, right? Another example, Canada borders the United States to the north. I'm giving you the location of Canada based on the location of the United States. If you think about how you give locations to your friends and family on a daily basis, we mostly think of in terms of relative locations, right? We presume the person we're talking to has some base understanding of Otterbeins campus, right? Or the city of Columbus or the city of Westerville. And we give a location in terms of those other landmarks, right? So that's relative location. Another way we can think about location is absolute location. So absolute location refers to an exact point on Earth and commonly uses specific coordinates of longitude and latitude. So I'm going to take us to Google Earth. Has anybody explored Google Earth before? It's pretty cool. So let's find Rausch Hall's exact location using Google Earth. If Google Earth will load. Well, we do not need to know much of the... All right, so let's search Rausch Hall. This is my favorite part. Whoa. Oh, folks online cannot see this, huh? All right. Thanks, Ben. Let me stop sharing and then share, see if I can get this to work. Oh, okay. Good to know. Thank you. That's not what I wanted. That's what I wanted. Now can you all see it? Yes. Awesome. Okay, great. So here's Rausch Hall. Rausch Hall's absolute location, which if I put my clicker right here on Rausch Hall, it says it in the corner, but it's about 40 degrees, 7 minutes, and 28 seconds north. And it is 82 degrees, 56 seconds, and, 56 minutes and 9 seconds west. So what does all of that mean? I'm not going to ask you all to sort of understanding lines of latitude and longitude and being able to specify coordinates is not going to be a core part of this course. But what that's measuring is the distance from Rausch Hall, or from the equator, so the line of latitude that sort of cuts through the Earth. It's measuring Rausch Hall's distance north of that. And it's measuring Rausch Hall's distance west of the prime meridian, so the line of longitude that cuts through the center of the Earth. Not going to be an essential part of this course, but what I want you all to know is that is how we would give Rausch Hall's absolute location, right? Any questions there? Yes, Logan.
So absolute is only coordinates. So like if you gave like a specific street address, like the address of this building, would that be absolute or would that be relative?
So that would also be absolute. That's a good question. So if you gave me an address, 1 South Grove Street is Otterbine's address in Westerville. That's an absolute location, right? All right. Any other questions? Yes, Nick.
Do you know how often it changes just because of the shift of the land masses? How often do they update it or anything? I don't know. I'm just curious.
That's a really good question. My sense is that places in the continental United States, for example, there's very little shifting, at least, I mean, there is some shifting, but it's over a long span of time. Now, the question would be, if we were talking about sort of the Arctic or the Antarctic, we see much more shifts there, right? So it depends, again, on what you're talking about. But the sort of form of measurement is the same, right? So in a world in which Rausch Hall moves significantly, its coordinates would change, right? Its coordinates do not follow it when it moves, in other words. It's a good question. Folks online, can you see my slide again? No. Okay. Let's try this one more time. Not yet. Okay. Now, can you see my slide? Great. Awesome. Okay. So that's sort of answering the where question. But in addition to talking about places' locations relative to one another in a spatial sense, and in terms of their physical location, we can also talk about location in terms of how different places interact with one another. And here I want to introduce 2 terms that are going to be important and that are going to keep coming up in the course of this class. And those terms are the core and the periphery. So we might think of places in terms of whether they belong to the core or whether they belong to the periphery. So what is the core? You can think of the core as a sort of central business district. The core is an area where most goods and services are exchanged. It's a city of a lot of activity, typically economic activity, right? The core is often thought of as more urban. There are more people there. It's more densely populated. And the contrast to the core is what we might call the periphery and what some people might call the hinterland. So hinterland is a German term that means the land behind, but I'm going to talk less in terms of hinterland and more in terms of periphery. So the periphery is more sparsely populated. It is often where the goods sold in the core are manufactured. It might include, for example, rural farmland. So it might be the sort of part of a territory where people produce agricultural products, soy, corn, etc. And those products, those goods, then get moved to the core where they are bought and sold. Okay? So again, the periphery relies on the core to sell goods, but also the core relies on the periphery to sort of create raw materials. So this is kind of a metaphor, but can anybody think of, for example, the Columbus metropolitan area? What would you call the core of that area, and what would you think of as the periphery? Does anybody want to take a stab at it? Yeah, Nick.
Downtown versus Dublin, Westerville.
Yeah, exactly. Viv, did you want to add? Yeah, so we can think of downtown Columbus, which is where kind of the hub of economic activity, where a lot of people have jobs, right, in a variety of industries. And the sort of periphery being these outlying areas, Dublin, Westerville, Reynoldsburg. Do you think the Otterbein campus has a core and a periphery? We're sort of like stepping back and getting a little meta. Is there a place on Otterbein's campus where more activity happens, where people tend to congregate more? Not now, obviously, but yeah, Logan.
I mean, you say the core could technically be like the classroom, that's where you do all your learning, and then the periphery could be like potentially like a dorm or like anywhere where you're going to use that knowledge.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it, Viv.
Could it be like the CC or the rank or sporting events?
Yeah, that's another way of thinking about it. So what do we do here at Otterbein? We learn. And so the classroom can be thought of as our core. It's where we're all coming together to learn. And then you sort of go off to your dorms, which are less densely populated than they are normally, given current circumstances, right? And some of you who are commuters, you go to your homes. And so that's a good way of thinking about it. Another great way of thinking about it is what Viv brings up, right? We have the campus center. So I went to the campus center to get my parking decal, and I went there to get my Cardinal card. Those are sort of essential services that I need, right? So that's a place I go, and then I go back to my office, right, where it's just me. So if we can really apply these concepts of core and periphery to sort of lots of places, right? One of the places where we think a lot in terms of core and periphery is actually globally, in a global sense. We often think of certain countries as being part of the global core, while certain countries are part of the global periphery. So the core areas, which are those here that are in blue, we typically think of North America, the United States, as well as Europe, Australia. This is sort of synonymous with industrialized countries. Countries that take raw goods and manufacture them, right? So, for example, your cell phone is produced probably in an area that forms part of the core, or what we might think of as a semi-periphery, right? So that brings me to the next category, semi-periphery. These are what we think of as sort of emerging powers, emerging developing countries. These are places like China, India, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. They're not the sort of Western industrialized countries that we think about, when we think about the United States and Germany or the UK, right? But they're getting there. And sort of one of the big debates is, are these countries that we think of as on the semi-periphery actually going to surpass, or are they surpassing, these traditional countries within the core on the global stage in terms of political and economic power? So we can also think of then a global periphery. These are countries in South and Central America, countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as North Africa and the Middle East, as well as some countries in Europe and Central Asia. And so when we call these countries peripheral, I don't want you all to think that core is synonymous with important and periphery is synonymous with unimportant, because that is not the case at all. It's very easy to argue that the core countries would not be at the core if it weren't for the periphery, because peripheral countries require, or core countries, pardon me, require the raw materials that are often sent from peripheral countries in order to manufacture goods, in order so that we can, so for example, something else you have in your cell phone is lithium. Where does lithium come from? Well, one of the places lithium comes from is a small country in South America called Bolivia. It's right here. Bolivia has these giant salt flats, and that's where lithium comes from. So that lithium is sent to China and other places to make the batteries in your cell phone. You would not have batteries in your cell phone if it weren't for this country that's considered a peripheral country, Bolivia. So that's just one example. And there are also wide-ranging debates among not only geographers, but economists and political scientists about why some countries remain on the periphery. And a lot of it has to do with the economic relations between the core and the periphery. Okay? Does anybody have any questions there about this idea of a global core and a global periphery? This is not a static map. This is changing, right? Countries who were on the periphery are now in the semi-periphery. Countries who are here on the semi-periphery could very well become part of the core. So this is not sort of a fixed, this is how the world is. Things change, right? But the point here is that this is a way to sort of think about the interaction between places. Does anybody have any questions? I have a question online. Let's see. Erin, do you want to unmute your mic and ask a question?
Quick question. These few countries that are kind of like labeled as the other, would you say that does that kind of work against them for being the other? Is it a country's goal to be either a core or a periphery, or does it kind of just like not really matter?
Yeah, so these countries that are listed as other, these tend to be, so in South America, for example, this is French Guiana and Suriname, and these are countries that tend to have very close relationships rooted sort of in the colonial era, which we're going to be talking about in this class, with core countries. So I think what this other category means, and it's a very good question, and I will look it up and get back to you to confirm, but I think what this means is that these countries aren't necessarily, we don't list them as periphery or core because they're so fused with other core countries. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, and in terms of your other question, are countries trying to get to the core and be part of the global core? Certainly. I think there is a sort of conventional wisdom that as you develop, like development is good. You want to transition from being a country that primarily produces agricultural goods to a country that manufactures high-tech goods or is very much integrated into the global service sector, right? But the barriers to countries doing that are not just sort of what's going on in that country, right? It's not just about people's level of education and educational opportunities, for example. There are dynamics between the core and periphery that sort of keep these peripheral countries peripheral. There are structural barriers to overcoming that hurdle and that maintain these global inequalities. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, moving on. I want to talk a little bit about population, where people are, populations and population growth. So just as geographers can talk about where people are located, we can also explore why population growth occurs in certain places rather than others. So as you can see, the three largest population clusters in the world are located in Europe, on the one hand, but even larger than that, countries in South Asia, so India, Bangladesh, and parts of East Asia, specifically China and parts of Japan. Does anybody know what the most populous country in the world is? Does anybody want to take a guess?
India?
India, the most populous country in the world, it's second to China. Yeah. Does anybody know what the most populous city in the world is?
Hong Kong?
Close. Yeah, Brett.
Beijing?
Close. Actually, Beijing is number 9. Did you have an answer, Selena, or anybody? Want to take a guess?
Shanghai?
Shanghai on the list. Shanghai is number 3. Getting closer. Actually, the most populous city in the world is Tokyo, Japan. And second is Delhi, New Delhi in India. Third is Shanghai. Fourth is Sao Paulo in Brazil. You don't have to write all this down. I'm just telling you all for your own knowledge. Fifth, also in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, is Mexico City. Sixth, we have Cairo in Egypt. 7, we have Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. 8, Mumbai, another city in India. 9, we have Beijing. I think somebody mentioned Beijing, Brad mentioned Beijing. And 10 is Osaka, also in Japan.
What's the highest U.S. city on that list?
The highest U.S. city on that list, that's a great question.
New York.
New York City, I believe. Yep, New York City. And LA is number 2, and Chicago is number 3. But New York City has a population of 8.6 million. The 10th city on that list, Osaka, has a population of 19.2 million. So that's over twice.
So they're
New York
still
City.
pretty far down that list.
Yeah.
In terms of like world population.
Yeah, yeah. What do you notice about all those cities that I named? Yeah, Carson.
They're pretty well known for everyone.
Yeah, they're pretty well known. Nick.
They're old.
They're old. Who's raising their hand here? Asa.
I would say that they also supply us a lot of our imports. And cheaper.
Yes. Yes. They are places where U.S. companies have created manufacturing plants and centers to manufacture goods that then come back here to the United States.
There are locations where typically you tend to live with like your entire family. So like nobody tends to leave, which is why the population grows.
Yeah. So that's also very true. They have very different norms for what you do, like where you live, what you do. Yes?
Closer to the equator.
They're closer to the equator. They're also not in North America or Western Europe, right? These areas that we think of as the core, right? In terms of the economic core. So the countries that have the highest populations tend to be those that we think of as sort of semi-peripheral or peripheral. And this is kind of no accident. So we're going to be talking a little bit about why this is the case in a second. But when we think about populations and population growth, there are a few concepts we have to sort of wrap our brain around. So the first is the birth rate. So this explains how many people are essentially being added to the population in a given year. And we measure the birth rate in terms of the number of live births per 1,000 people in a given year. Now the death rate, or the mortality rate, is essentially what the opposite of that, right? It is the number of deaths per 1,000 people in a given year. So it's not on the list, but it just replaced live births with number of deaths per 1,000 people, and you have the death rate. So when we bring those two together, we get what we call the rate of natural increase. So the rate of natural increase refers to the birth rate minus the death rate, minus deaths per 1,000 people in a given year. And that's how we get the rate of natural increase. So that rate of natural increase is one of the ways in which we might think about population growth. How many people are being added to the population in a given year, in a given place? How many people are being subtracted from the population in a given year, in a given place? That is the rate of natural increase. Now, the birth rate is affected very much so by something that we call the total fertility rate. The total fertility rate is the average number of children born to a woman during her childbearing years. As we're going to see in a second through a comparison, the total fertility rate in places in what we think of as the developing world can be sometimes as high as 4 or more children per woman. While in other places, it may be only 1 or 2. So let's look at a comparison here. Some examples. Here's the United States, and here's Guatemala, which is one of the countries I study in Central America. What's the birth rate in the United States? So in 2019, the birth rate in the United States was 12 births per 1,000 people. While in Guatemala, it was 24 births per 1,000 people. So the birth rate in Guatemala was twice that of the birth rate in the United States in 2019. The death rate was 8.8 deaths per 1,000 people in 2019. in the United States, while in Guatemala it was 4.7 deaths per 1,000 people. So the death rate is actually lower in Guatemala than it is in the United States. Does anybody have a guess as to why that's the case? Yeah, Nick.
This is really out there. I was just reading about how poorer countries that are more in famine, that the genes passed on from the woman, they come out of the womb hungrier and they know that they're not going to live as long, so that they reproduce faster and at a younger age than more established, wealthier companies or countries. So that's why they have more babies.
So that's interesting. So this is both an explanation that seems evolutionary in nature, right? It's based on evolution, kind of, right? But it gets at something that's really fundamental about a fundamental difference between these two countries, which is the total fertility rate, right? So if we go down one bullet point, the total fertility rate in the United States is 1.73 births per woman. This was 2018. I couldn't find 2019 data. And in 2019 in Guatemala, it was 2.85 births per woman. So women in Guatemala are having more children, which means that the population of Guatemala is younger. And medicine and technology is such that even though Guatemala has higher levels of poverty and inequality, there are more younger people to live longer. Well, in the United States, the population is older, and so we have more deaths per 1,000 people. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions there? So when we're thinking about the rate of natural increase and sort of why populations are declining or growing at rates, it's important to think about the fertility rate and what that means for the overall age distribution of the population. So a number of factors might contribute to the population characteristics of a particular country. But there's something that's called the demographic transition model, which we're going to walk through now in the remaining minutes of class, that can help us think about some of these dynamics. Fertility rate, death rate, age of population, increases and decreases. So the demographic transition model demonstrates how population growth shifts as countries develop, become wealthier, and more industrialized. So stage one is a stage that you can sort of associate. Think about, has anybody taken a history course on feudal Europe? Sort of thinking very early Europe. Hand raised. Is that a yes? Oh, does somebody want to ask a question online? Oh. Yes, okay.
No.
Sorry.
I have taken a class on it.
Oh,
not that
awesome.
I have a question.
Oh, cool, great. So for those of you who've taken courses on sort of European history, you know that in the context of feudal Europe, birth rates and death rates were both very high. Because on the one hand, we were talking about agricultural societies, so societies based on manual labor and the production of agricultural goods. And so it required people. So birth rates were very high. But at the same time, things like disease and drought were also rampant because societies had not yet developed the technology to mitigate those things. So death rates were both very high. So I'm going to flip ahead. You can see in stage 1, right here, that we have sort of death rates and birth rates that are sort of fluctuating very similarly. And so as a result, so this orange line signals total population. This blue line, which we see sort of curving up and down in stage 1, is birth rate. Death rate is the green line. And so they're about at the same place, so we're not getting a lot of population growth. So this begins to change for countries that are in stage 2. Stage 2 countries experience a decline in death rates because agricultural productivity improves. So harvests are less affected by disease and drought. Famines are less rampant. And we also see improvements in public health. And so as a result, we see death rates go down, as we'll see here. So look at stage 2. See this green line? Death rates are going down with that green line, whereas birth rates are staying the same. So what happens when death rates go down and birth rates stay the same? The population goes up. Fewer people are dying, right? So that's stage 2. Stage 3, what happens? So in stage 3, modernization and technology bring continued improvements that continue to decrease the death rate. However, at the same time, social changes, such as the status of women, begin to change as well. This is also a moment in which societies develop new technologies like contraception. So in stage 3, we see both a continuing decline in the death rate, but we also start to see a decline in the birth rate. And so while the population is still growing, as you'll see from this chart in stage 3, it's growing at a much slower pace. Moving on to stage 4, what happens? So in stage 4, which is the stage where we might think a lot of sort of industrialized countries are at right now, say the United States, we have both fairly low birth rates and death rates. And so given these continuing trends in terms of technology, medicine, contraception, the place of women in society, the increase of women in the workforce, for example, we see population growth really start to level off because both birth rates are low and death rates are low. And then finally, in stage 5, which are really, if you think about countries around the world, they haven't, no one's quite reached stage 5, but you can clearly see certain countries heading in that direction. Birth rates and death rates remain so low that the elderly population, the population of older people in a society, actually begin to outpace and exceed the number of young people in a society. A country's age goes up. Countries become older. So this is sort of what we think about as the 5th stage of the demographic transition model. Does anybody have any questions on this? So again, this is a sort of way for you to think about both the where where people are, and then the why. Why people are where they are, why populations are growing in certain places, growing less intensely in other places. So I'm going to stop here because we are at 10:06 and I took you a minute over, even though I promised not to. My sincerest apologies. We are going to pick up with the sort of question of what makes a region on Friday, and then we're going to get into some stuff about migration. I'm really sorry for keeping you a minute over. I don't know why I had in my head that we end at 10:10. But have a great rest of your day. Let me know if you have any questions. And please, please, please fill out your survey and complete your discussion post if you have not already done so. It's due before class on Friday. Yes, question. The videos of the lectures? Yeah. So those are going to be uploaded after class on the day of. Yeah.
We're here Friday, right? Not online.
Yes, we are here on Friday. Class is here on Friday. Thanks everyone online. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you on Friday.